The Sunfallen Road, Chapter 5. I had never been particularly religious, despite my parents' deep faith in the Catholic Church, and it surprised me when I discovered that the regent kept a chapel in his house. When I had risen the following evening, finding a pitcher of fresh blood waiting for me on my dresser, along with a glass, I had drunk deeply, dressed myself in a burgundy evening dress with black ribbons, and gone wandering through the halls. I found the chapel in the undercroft, although I could not enter. 2 servants guarded the door. "The regent is at prayers," one of them told me. I was surprised. "Does he pray every evening?" "Yes," said the other servant. "He will emerge shortly." I nodded. "Thank you." They both bowed shallowly to me, and I turned to leave. I decided to explore the library. I hadn't had a chance to look at the books there yet, and being a scholar at heart, I loved to read. I wondered what kind of books I would find there. I entered the library, breathed the scent of leather and paper. I found that the shelves were well organized and labeled according to subject matter. And so many books, on so many subjects, I was happy enough to dance. I was devouring a text on integral calculus when Klaus entered. I was so absorbed that I didn't realize he'd entered until he said softly, "Good evening, Melpomene." I jumped. He was right in front of me. I set my book aside and got to my feet, curtsied. "Good evening, Your Grace." "What are you reading?" He smiled as though amused, although his eyes reflected another emotion that I couldn't identify. I showed him the text. "Ah, mathematics. Never my strong point, I'm afraid," he said, laughing. "Most of those books belonged to my creator. I inherited them when he passed on." "He had excellent taste," I joked, moving to put the book back on its shelf and then returning to join him. "What happened to him?" I asked curiously. He lost his smile. "He was unable to cope with the idea of living forever, and so he killed himself." I lowered my head. "I'm sorry." Klaus shook his head. "To be honest, it was probably for the best. His grief at living so long made him cruel. He was never cruel to me, but he was cruel to others, and it broke my heart. Every time I think I am becoming like him, I remember how much it hurt to see him that way, and I am myself again." I nodded. I thought I understood. "Have you eaten?" he asked. "Yes. Someone left a pitcher in my room." "Good," said Klaus. "I want you to come into Berlin with me tonight. I have business there. But first, have you considered my proposal?" I looked at him and took a deep breath and said, "I will accept your offer." "Excellent," he cried, and he seemed truly delighted. "Your duties shall begin tonight, then. I will teach you more of our ways in the months to come, so do not worry." I nodded, and I managed a small smile when the regent returned. "Klaus, I must ask you something." He looked at me. "Certainly. How did you know to send your men to collect Deshaya and I?" He frowned, as though he had not expected that question. "Deshaya has made children before, without my permission, and sometimes has even left them in the streets to fend for themselves, disastrous occasions all. We watched her, and most closely. When she made you, she was already on her last chance. One of my men watched as she took you, and when he returned to me, I told him to take 2 other enforcers and wait until you had awoken, and then to bring you both here, to my stead." "But how did you know she would convert me?" "She has well-marked habits. She looks at her children a certain way. Did she kiss you?" "Had I still been human, I would have flushed." I nodded. "That is her calling card, you might say. She kisses the ones she finds beautiful, and she makes them her children. But regardless, we could not arrest her until the deed was done. As the saying goes, innocent until proven guilty." I considered this. I understood then what Maria had said about Deshaya's reputation. I also knew, from her few conversations with me, that few regents were as merciful with subjects who broke vampiric law as Klaus Cantor was. It seemed to me that he should have killed her the first time she broke this law, and then maybe I would still be human. I said so. He lowered his eyes. "You are right, of course, but many moons ago, when I was mortal, and still had mortal kin, My mother told me that a person must always be given another chance to make right with themselves. I gave Deshaya as many chances as I thought I could, but even mercy must have limits and then must give way to justice. I nodded. I understand. It is a pity that any of us have to understand that as well as we do, he said, rising to his feet and offering me his hand. I took it, and he helped me to my feet and walked with me towards the door. You look lovely, by the way, said Klaus as we left the library. I think I would have blushed if I still could. Thank you, Your Grace. I had a somewhat plump figure, with full breasts and hips. My mother had often remarked that I took after my father's folk, husky and full-figured. That type of figure isn't uncommon in either Greece or Spain, although my sisters and mother had been as slender as spindles on spinning wheels, with beautiful faces overall. I reminded myself to breathe as we paused in the hall to retrieve our coats and hats. It was a cold night, and regardless of whether we felt cold, the pretense of being human must be carried out. We went outside. I breathed in the cold air, although I no longer needed oxygen, felt it settle in my lungs. I felt alive, even though I wasn't. Klaus smiled at me. Ready? He indicated the horse-drawn carriage that waited in front of the manse. I nodded. He took my hand, helped me into the carriage, and after he'd climbed in after me, we set off towards the city. Would you mind telling me the assignment? I asked. We are going to see my financier, Mr. Becker, said Klaus, leaning back against the cushioned seat. He oversees the tax flow for our community as well as my own investments. After that, we are going to visit 2 safe houses where vampires gather in the city and speak with the guardians of them. You don't need to do anything, just watch and listen. I nodded. I was good at both of those things. We arrived at a modest but well-appointed house in the city. Klaus helped me from the carriage, and a servant descended the front stairs to greet us. Good evening, Your Grace. Please be welcome, you and your guest. Klaus nodded, and we were shown in. Almost at once, we were greeted by a short and stocky man who came bounding down the front hallway stairs. Your Grace, always a pleasure to see you. And who is this lovely young woman you have brought with you? His blue eyes fairly twinkled, although there was something about his smile I didn't trust. Still, I smiled back. This is Miss Melpomene Aguilar, the new emissary of my court, Herr Becker, said Klaus, casting me a brief glance. Miss Aguilar, this is Randall Becker, my financier. A pleasure, I said, curtsying and extending my hand. Herr Becker pressed his lips to my fingers. A pleasure to meet you, miss. He straightened and said, Very well, to business? The voices were clamoring, but for the moment I ignored them and followed them up the stairs and into Becker's office, where he pulled a large leather-bound ledger from a drawer and opened it up. The 2 men went over numbers together, including who had paid what and how much, expenses incurred by Klaus's household, profits, and stock prices. I looked on and paid strict attention, but something didn't make sense. I saw something that Klaus, with his non-mathematical eyes, did not see. An income stream, a small one, that had not been accounted for. I pointed and tapped the page with my finger. What about this? Mr. Becker looked up. Yes, my dear? This sum here, I said, pointing. This has not yet been accounted for. Is that not also owed to His Grace? Mr. Becker blinked and then laughed. Oh, yes, of course, my dear. You have very keen eyes. But in that moment, I saw why I hadn't liked his smile to begin with. He probably made a habit of deceiving Klaus, and hadn't expected anyone, least of all a woman, to catch a mistake. They finally concluded their calculations and the number the regent was owed from the financier that month. The 2 men shook hands, and Herr Becker took my hand in his own and bowed to me. Farewell, Miss Aguilar. Farewell, I murmured, and left with Klaus. When we were on our way to the first safe house, I said, simply, He's cheating you. Nonsense. He has taken care of my affairs for decades. Why should he? I pay him well. Nevertheless, he is, I said. Melpomene, I would have you stop this, said the regent, casting me a faintly angry look. I won't have you slandering Herr Becker. He has been a loyal servant for many years. I shrugged. Forgive me if I spoke out of turn. It is your affair, after all. He huffed and looked out the window at the passing buildings. A long silence passed between us. It made me nervous, but I tried not to let on. "How would you find out?" he asked me, finally. "A good financier keeps records. A better financier keeps 2 separate sets," I said, examining my fingernails. "If I had a warrant to search his house, I could find them. I'm good at finding things." He considered. "Why do you think he is cheating me? When he greeted us, there was something in his smile that I did not like, and when I pointed to the sum you didn't see, he blinked and something crossed his face, almost like he knew he'd been caught. I'd be willing to bet that that was his second ledger and not the one he usually shows you, and he mixed them up." The regent sighed, rubbed his chin, regarded me carefully. "I have no reason to lie, Klaus," I said. "What could I possibly gain?" "I shall think on it," he said, after looking at me for a very long time and in a tone that suggested I should drop the subject. I did, and we rode on in silence.